All right. Good evening. Welcome to our October meeting of the Vancouver, Washington IONS Community Group. The mission of the Institute of Noetic Sciences is to reveal the interconnected nature of reality through scientific exploration and personal discovery in order to create a more compassionate, thriving, and sustainable world. Vancouver, Washington IONS Community Group has served the members and friends of the Institute of Noetic Sciences for the past 20 years and is independent of the Institute itself. So welcome. And I'm going to ask Milt Markowitz, who was so kind to bring us Yvonne as our speaker tonight. We're very excited. And so Milt, I'd like to ask you to formally introduce her, please.
Okay, thank you. And what a pleasure it is to introduce Yvonne. I consider her a dear friend. As all of you know who read the write-up, she is a doctor, PhD in environment and sustainability. And she is an educator and a teacher. She is a Métis woman who represents her people and all the Native people just beautifully well. We've known each other for just probably over a decade. She was quite a special person at an Indigenous Indian Institute gathering in Santa Fe about 10 years ago. And I read that she was an expert in language, which she is. And I was very, very tuned in to ancient languages. And so I introduced myself to her the first day, and she was wonderfully welcoming. And we decided we would talk, and we tried to talk each day. And she was one busy lady. Boy, she was facilitating and teaching and in demand to talk to people and so forth. That's just who she is. And finally, on the last day, we got together, and I remember sharing the endowments, the gifts of creation that are gifts to all life and how they're embedded in the language as I understood it. And I remember, Yvonne, tears came to your eyes and said, you understand the energy that we feel when we speak our language. And I mention that because it is so important that that there is a feature in our language, ours is alphabetic, where a lot of us can't understand or can't know that we don't know what we don't know, that it's available in the language, the endowments of creation. And what's really beautiful about it in the native languages is that it's always expressed with gratitude, awe, wonder, and wisdom and beauty. So that was a beautiful part of meeting Yvonne, and we've been connected ever since. She sent me copies of the Cree language, which has the same endowments and the gratitude, and it connects us with life, all life, and the land, and with the spirit of the land. And so I'm hoping that you will just listen deeply, listen to the heartfelt message that that Yvonne shares when she talks about her culture and the way of living in balance and harmony with the earth. So without further ado, Yvonne, I hope I've introduced you well, and please, it's all yours.
I love that story, Milt, because it just struck me like a thunderbolt. When I think at the time I was deep into trying to understand the origins of the words, the Cree language, and the way it's explained. Words are, you have to be so careful with the words you use. That's what the elders tell us, because the words, like Milt said, the words themselves carry power, and we've forgotten what those mean a lot of times, the parts of the word, and how putting together different combinations to make a word imbues a power. And the old people tell us that. And so you have to be really careful with what you say about people, gossiping, saying bad things about people. You're releasing different kinds of energies out into the world, positive or negative, in that way that it can affect people around you and yourself, even can make you sick even. Yeah. So thank you for that introduction. You got me thinking about a lot of things, and I was talking with a group of about 30 educators earlier today at an event. And uh, it's just, I mean, the more we share amongst each other, I think the better our chances are going to be for what the Cree called Wâhkôhtowin, as a good life. It's a good life, yeah. So shall I just start now then, Dottie? Yeah, okay. Okay, let's see if I can get us going here. Can you see that?
Yes.
Okay. I'm gonna shrink down my little participant panel on the side, so I suppose you can still see me, and we'll get going here. So yeah, so a Métis view of Wâhkôhtowin, this ancient knowledge for a sustainable earth, and it's something I've put my life towards, and learning. It's just a constant journey of lifelong learning. So I don't see myself as an expert or anything. I'm still a learner, still learning from my elders, and the people around me. But I want to thank Milt for recommending me, and Dottie and Paul. I want to thank you and the Ions group for inviting me here today, and really for all your efforts to contribute positivity into the world. You know, for me as an educator, I guess my question is, you know, in 100 years, what will education be like? You know, 2021, 24 isn't that far away, but when we think about 100 years past, um, uh, how much things have changed, and how rapidly things are changing now. So I guess only time will tell, you know, what our path into the future is going to be. But I think we have that choice of making a good path to honoring our relations and to build towards a good life, that mio pamatsuin. I always start by acknowledging the first peoples, the indigenous peoples of the lands and the territories. I was making little notes on the side as you were introducing yourself, and you know, we have so many territories with us tonight, and so I think that's reflective of also of us as a collective of people, that we have different heritage. And no matter where we are on Turtle Island, you know, North America, Indigenous peoples here in Canada have really called for the public to take steps toward building relationships of integrity with the First Nation, the Métis, and the Inuit. And one of the ways we do that is with a land acknowledgement, and thinking about the first peoples that lived in these areas, those who have migrated and resettled. All of us came from somewhere. So in Winnipeg, where I am, this is the traditional territory of the Anishinaabe, the Innu, and the Dakota peoples. And it's also part of the people I come from, the Red River Métis. So as you read in my probably in the little advertisement that came around, I don't think you have recognition of Métis people in the United States. I know you don't. So here, under our Constitution, our federal Constitution, and there are three groups: First Nation, Métis, and Inuit. And the Métis people, as you might have read, were emerged during the fur trade era, and were a mixing of you know, the British, the English, the Scottish, the fur traders, the French. There were no white women in the territories, so they often took Indian wives, and later Métis wives. And so I think what happened with our ancestors really was is the legacy that we still bear is that we weren't quite white enough for the white people's families, and we weren't quite Indian enough for the Indian families. So people sort of began to cling together and form their own communities of mixed blood people. And so politically, you know, it's not something that is a popular or politically correct. They don't like us to say, oh, well, we're mixed blood people, because it sort of gives the impression that we're a lesser than of other people. And in fact, the reality is that the Métis formed very vibrant cultures of their own, and mixed and took and shaped the things that they needed to have a good life. So in a nutshell, that's a little bit about the Métis people. And I want you to, in your heart, to acknowledge, you know, the people of your territories, the territories where you're from. So land acknowledgements help us to remember with humility that we're so dependent on the health of the natural world, and the precious water, the land, the air, and the energy systems of our planet, you know, really have to be first and foremost in our choices and our decision-making processes, which is what I'll talk about tonight. One of the things, like one of the big issues that often comes up, or that is, you know, globally, a global issue, is the idea about climate change. And you know, the teaching about, you know, our atmosphere, the air around us being the breath of the Creator. It reminds us, I think, every breath you draw brings you into this sacredness of life, and without it you couldn't survive. So, you know, that's the first energy. If I can change this. Yeah, so what is Wâhkôhtowin? Well, it refers to the interconnected nature of relationships, communities, and natural systems. The literal meaning is kinship, although it's often used to refer to Cree law. So that's a little definition. And these teachings are really coming up a lot now in academic literature and scholarship to advance some of the high-level thinking about complex systems theory, climate change, social justice, and even foundations of economic longevity. If you don't understand the foundations of life in terms of planetary health, there's no really going to be no need to worry about an economy. So I have a dear friend, he's a Cree elder, Wes Finday. We often chat on the phone, and we were talking about all of this one day, and he said, well, you have to ask yourself, who are you? You know, when you look in the mirror, who are you? And he said the answer is that we should say, I'm a child of creation. I belong to the land. I have to learn how to be part of this process. And the sacred stories teach you about your humanity. And so a lot of times we disregard those sacred stories from different nations. And yet, in the listening and the learning and contemplation, we can learn a lot about ourselves and our place in this world. Okay, let me get a little back into the real stuff here now. So I introduced myself as Yvonne, and you know, all of our life experiences that we have is something that really it shapes you. In Indigenous cultures and traditions, I would say all of them that I'm aware of, it's considered rude to talk about yourself too much, at least. And yet, as an academic, that is the number one expectation. You talk a lot about how smart you are and how good your research is, and all of those things. So it makes you a little bit crazy to have to force yourself into different forums where you're doing that, and it really goes against your nature to talk about that. But it is how we communicate now and how we share stories. And I'm still practicing. You know, I teach hundreds of students, and yet at the same time, um, uh, we don't often get a chance just to sit and talk about our families or who we really are. We're always talking about, you know, academics. Yeah. So so I was that's me in the dog sled, by the way. That was last year. We went up. I had a foot injury, so I had to ride in the sled the whole way. And that's my sister driving the sled. She's amazing. She runs about 10 to 15K every morning. And yeah, I'm going Wednesday. I'm flying out to where she is, and we're doing another they do dryland harness racing in the summer to stay in condition for the winter sleds. So I signed on as crew this year. So I have it's so much fun. I love it, being out in nature. The dogs love it. Oh, it's amazing. Yeah. So I'm from here, if you can see that. So you can see where you are on the map, down, you know, the different parts in the yellow. And I live here now in Winnipeg. And if you go straight north from me, you would run into the Hudson's Bay, the big blue area there. That's where where the polar bears live in my province. They live on the coast at Churchill, around Churchill, and up into the Arctic area. Yeah, so just a little bit, you know, I was raised in a small village of about 50 people, and later then moved to bigger centers. But where I grew up, it was all, we were all surrounded by forest, and the the wildlife. There was ponds, there were frogs, there was probably bears and wolves, but we never worried about that, and our parents never ever prevented us from going and playing in the bush. Um, I always felt safe there for some reason, and I love it. But those landscapes from those early years have changed a lot now. Most of it's gone. It's been cleared for agriculture. And the town is gone. It's been replaced with cabins and outfitter services. So we get a lot of people coming up from from different parts of the country, or the continent, and hunting. So we are, that in that era where we're selling that experience. We're selling the biggest, the healthiest wildlife for profit by outfitter services. And although I was raised on wild food, wild meat, for most of my young life, I feel really sad when I see animals being killed for trophy hunting or sport, or the worst for me is when people say, well, they're a nuisance, I'll just shoot them. Yeah. So Indigenous traditions of our territories, and I think most, teach that's considered a breach of natural law, when you assault another species. So I live in a city of nearly 1 million people, but I really continue to be guided by the teachings of the concept of Wâhkôhtowin, that the world around me isn't um, mine to commandeer so much as mine to recognize I'm a part of that, and the kinship, um, uh, whether it's wildlife, birds, insects, rocks, water, we're part of that. And I tell my students, really, we are the environment, which in another form, it's gotten up and walking around for a short space of years, and then we'll go back to being part of the environment again. So while we're here, we can talk to each other, we can laugh, we can eat, we can enjoy all parts of life. And the old people say we are here having a physical experience so that when our spirit returns to the realm, that we will remember these experiences that we had in the physical world. So I made this little drawing. Milt, you've seen this before. This sustainability concept map with Nihao legal traditions. So the Cree people are where I'm from. It's predominantly Cree in Saskatchewan and even parts of Manitoba. Um, they say that was because the Cree had access to smallpox vaccines, so more survived than some of the other tribal groups. Yeah. So if you look on the left, there's a concept in Cree teaching. It's called Otsinowin, and it's the breaking of law against non-humans. So those are the animals, the birds, the big mammals. So it includes things like picking or harvesting things from the natural world without following protocols, like putting your tobacco down, or praying before you take stuff. Can you imagine how different the world would be if everybody did follow protocols? So polluting is considered breaking of natural law, poisoning, cruel, any kind of cruelty to animals, even if you're hunting and you're not a good hunter, you're not practicing quick kills. Yeah, that's considered breaking of natural law. Even swearing is considered a breaking of natural law. And again, it's that breath, the breath and what you're putting out into the air. On the other side of the screen, we have Wâhkôhtowin, which is the breaking of physical or spiritual law against other humans. Yeah, so it literally means stepping over the law. And so if you harm another person, if you physically harm them or swear at them or whatever, anything that harms another person is now that is a very, very, very old concept. So old that we don't know. They call it time immemorial, the time before human memory, that these words were part of the culture. And so when you think about that, how wise people were in those days, when we think about in the center circle, environment is generally considered to have three parts in sustainability: environment, social considerations, and then economics. And each is interdependent. There's different kinds of ways to represent that, but I chose this one because to me it seems like if you imagine a platform, that's the planet and the environment on which people live and have a better or worse life depending on where they live. And then the people create economies wherever they are. So one is dependent on the other. There's different ways to look at it. Some people say, well, it minimizes the importance of economy because economy also has a huge impact on environment. So maybe there's a feedback loop. But whatever way you choose to think about it, it is, those are the three parts. Yeah. So when we're thinking about what you're seeing here, it's important, I think, because what I'm going to show you next, I want you to think about that in pre-colonial times. So before Métis people even came from this intermarriage, the First Nations people, the Inuit people, were thriving, self-sufficient societies. They had robust cultures, languages, legal traditions, education systems, and other kinds of things that every society would need to live in harmony with the land. And so from the time of contact and colonization, those systems were disrupted and Indigenous people's lives were changed forever. So for some of you who may not be familiar with the story, the residential schools in Canada were part of a government-led assimilation policy that was aimed at really forcibly integrating Indigenous children into Canadian society. That particular school is from BC, but they all looked more or less the same. Yeah, big red brick buildings. Yeah. And so the institutions themselves across Canada were operated by various churches, different denominations, and all of them were funded by the Canadian government. So Indigenous children were taken from their families and their communities, often by coercion or force. Not always. Sometimes people sent their children there because they thought that was the right thing to do. But they were placed in the schools and it was a really dramatic experience for them. They were often forbidden from speaking their languages or practicing cultural traditions. And the conditions in the school were really harsh. There was a lot of reported physical abuse, emotional abuse, sexual abuse. And so this legacy of residential schools in Canada, and they also existed in the United States, but they had really profound and intergenerational impacts on Indigenous communities that really resulted in like the erosion of languages. Most people I know don't speak their mother tongue anymore. Culture, identity, as well as lasting trauma and social challenges. So efforts towards reconciliation and the acknowledgement of this chapter of Canadian history do continue, including the work of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission here in Canada, which resulted in 94 calls to action. Yeah, in 2015. So it was sort of narrowed down to, well, these are the things we need to be working on to try to work for the next few generations to get things back on track. A few years ago, I read a book. It was called The Reason You Walk by Wâhkôhtowin, and you might want to check it out. But it's a deeply personal story of this Anishinaabe man and his father. It was written, as he says, for the purpose of invoking hope, healing, and forgiveness. So Wob talks about the importance of family and reconciliation among people of diverse cultures and a future imagined for Indigenous peoples. And when I moved to Manitoba in 2018, one of the first people I met at a barbecue downtown by my university was this guy right here. And in October, so one year ago this month, this guy here, Wob, became our first premier, First Nations premier of Manitoba. That's like a governor, I guess. Yeah. So we've had other Indigenous leaders in the past, including from my own nation, which is the Métis Nation. Our cultural hero is Louis Riel, who was instrumental in the formation of the government of Manitoba and leading up to its entry into Confederation in 1870. He was also elected to federal parliament in 1873 and then again in 1874. But he was never able to take his place, his rightful place in Parliament, because he was fighting for the Métis and he was being persecuted. There was a bounty on his head, and they did catch him in Saskatchewan. So where I'm from, where my dad is from, that was sort of ground zero for the Métis resistance against the Canadian militia. So he surrendered, he gave himself up, and the only way that they could execute him was if they charged him with high treason, which they did, and they hung him. And it was 1885, there were mass hangings of Indigenous First Nation men, and it was a tactic of intimidation, to cow the people into capitulating to the influx of settlers and the government taking the land. So in my case, the Métis people, after the execution of Riel, people really went into hiding and denied their identity, denied their ancestry, because there was just frankly so much racism that it wasn't safe to be who you were. If you could pass for white or if you could pass for French, that's what people had to do. So it takes a long time to turn things around, but last year, in Manitoba in 2023. Louis Riel was finally recognized as the first premier of Manitoba back in those days. So we're still rebuilding, and it's going to take generations to come. But great things are still happening, and the last residential school closed in 1996 in Saskatchewan, Gordon's First Nation, and it's just been we've taken off. Things are really, there's a lot of good things happening. So, although Indigenous nations have cultures and languages that are really unique to each nation, there's a lot of shared principles and value systems. And the old people tell us that each one of us, each one of you, has a path to walk that is unique and meant specifically for you. So we gather experiences, we have a certain appearance, we seek to understand things when we're ready at our different levels of readiness, and we find strength in common values. So for Indigenous people, placing the well-being of the earth and its inhabitants is a rooted principle that's shared by most, I think, if not all, Indigenous cultures around the world. And I would ask if it's also a part of your cultural belief system. Oh, I'm going to say yes. Um, but we have to ask that question, what's more important than ensuring a healthy planet for the generations of people to come, those unborn generations? When I went to school, when I did my first education degree, I I wanted to be a science teacher, and it was really there really weren't any Indigenous people doing science studies at the time, but nevertheless, I wanted to do it, and I did. And so I went to a special school. I don't know if you have similar things in the United States. I think you do. I think they're called tribal colleges. But ours are like Métis school in partnership with a local university. So we had all of our professional classes, but we also had elders there with us. And we also did cultural activities and went to ceremonies and learned about that and learned how to take all of that and become a good teacher. And so now Suntep has graduated hundreds of, probably thousands of teachers, and we're all out there in different parts of the country. Yeah, so I went to school with people who were Cree, Dene, Dakota, Métis, and our elders were Anishinaabe, Cree. I'm trying to think who else we had. Métis. Yeah, and so we had a lot of different experiences, and uh, I think it was some of the happiest times of my life. But people are getting a bit more closed these days. There's more of a closed door policy unofficially. So people are kind of communities are not as giving as I think as they were a few decades ago, and more protective of their culture and traditions. Yep. So yeah, it was a great experience going to school for those years with other like-minded people, without having to explain ourselves or apologize for how we looked or what we believed or the food we ate. We just had a lot of fun, and we became awesome teachers. We were in big demand when we graduated as cross-culturally trained. Yeah. Um, yeah. And so, I think when I think about that, and I think about how people like in my dad's generation had to hide their identity, um, uh, w- basically in one generation, we're turning that around already where, you know, people are more than happy to reclaim those identities in public. These are two of the elders that I learned my teachings from. Elder Danny Musqua, he's Anishinaabe, and Elder Vicky Wilson, she's Nakota. Yeah, they're both passed away now, but I love them. Yep. So I went on, I taught adult education, I taught in a prison, I taught high school, and I mostly math and European history, which I knew very little about, but I had to learn. But I also was a biology teacher, and yeah, I love young people and the energy that they bring. At the time, there really was no content in provincial curriculum that included any kind of Indigenous wisdom or teaching. And so I really had to lean on my own knowledge to bring that into my classrooms and uh, to have my students be proud of that as well, and of what they learned. Yeah, so that also is changing around. I just, at the time, I was like, wow, you know, it's so easy to teach biology through these ancient traditions, through the things that were practiced and known. And yet we don't do that. And so that was a big question for me. I wish that we could do that. And it was a question that lingered in my mind for the next few years. But I left teaching and I went to work for in my nation, the Indigenous political organization. And I really wanted to make change happen faster. And so, you know, I signed up, I became a policy analyst and did all kinds of work in environmental policy. And uh, I don't know, it just really, all I did seemed to ever go to meeting after meeting after meeting. And it just really didn't seem to be touching me the way that, or making change the way I thought it would. This is our Parliament building, the one that Louis Riel was, actually, they snuck him in to sign the book. So there's a story about him leaping over a staircase banister and two of them running for their lives because somebody spotted them in there signing the registry. Yeah, it's a good story. So I went back to school, did a master's on Métis traditional environmental knowledge and science education. And then at the same time, I was working on another project with a Cree guy. Well, actually, he's mixed blood Cree and Inuit, but he identifies as Cree. So yeah, we worked on a couple of projects in the sciences, and really started an interest, I want to say. We found out the provincial government was going to change curriculum. They were going to renew it, and that only happens about once every 20 years. So when we got wind of this, we went into activation mode. We phoned everybody we knew. We called about 25 different organizations together. We even invited the provincial government curriculum writers. And we said, listen, you're going to rewrite the science curriculum. You need to include Indigenous content in it because we're just missing the mark. And they fought us tooth and nail for the first few weeks. And you know, I'm not a person who gets mad easily, but I walked out of one meeting. I was furious, and it was just, I think, just because the disrespectful behavior in the room was more than I could tolerate. And you know, but we came back and we ate together, we spent time together, got to know each other a little bit better. And really, you know, at the end of 2 years, and maybe a couple of years after, the result was that there's Indigenous outcomes and indicators in all science curriculum from kindergarten to grade 12. And so that was a really wonderful accomplishment for all of us, including the students who would learn from that curriculum. Yeah. And even the textbooks, they got a bunch of elders together and they questioned, they asked them, you know, like, could you tell us about your, you know, perception of like in grade 6, students learn about electricity. Well, the question was, well, what do Indigenous people know about electricity, or are there traditional teachings about that? And there are. So they had to follow protocol. They took their tobacco, they offered it to the elders. They asked them, could you teach us about this? And then they weren't sure how to write it down because they didn't want to take their voice away. And so I said, well, you don't have to, just say elders' teachings and just let them tell their own story, because that's traditionally how you teach. You tell a story and it will mean different things to different people, and that's okay. Yeah, so they did that. I'm really proud of that. We actually have access to using those textbooks in Manitoba public schools as well. Yeah. So as I said in the past, I worked for my own political organizations. We work on issues of the time, including biodiversity, climate change, species at risk, chemical pollutants, all of those things. The First Nations work on them, the Métis and the Inuit. So we work together with Canada. We work at the UN level, and it's I think we have made really amazing positive change in some of those forums. These are just some of the people I used to do you see this guy on the side with the orange and the little hat? Well, I just met him that day and I was talking away to him and I go, what do you do? He was from somewhere in Africa. He goes, oh, I'm a veterinarian. And I thought, wow, that's the kind of people we need at these meetings, you know, that they, you know, he knows about animal life, physiology, treats animals. And so here we are in these biodiversity forums where it's almost all lawyers. And the Indigenous forum, we're bringing in teachers, we're bringing in veterinarians, we're bringing in tribal leaders, and everybody is contributing. Yeah. So too many lawyers in those forums. Yeah. Yeah. So I went back to school. I did a PhD at School of Environment and Sustainability. And you know, I really wanted to know how issues of sustainability were. I knew about kindergarten to grade 12 public schools, but I didn't really know how we were doing with that across the country and post-secondary or institutions or higher education institutions. So, you know, I really, you know, I took that up. I talked to a bunch of people across the country in their programs, and I believe that the study of natural sciences and our human quest to sustain our existence into the future, it can't simply rely on science, and that there's an ancient, deeper wisdom that needs to be guiding our thought and our behavior. So, you know, I always say, well, it's not, we don't want to go back to living like in the old days, in the old days, like our ancestors did, but at the same time, taking those underlying principles that have sustained human life for tens of thousands of years needs to continue to shape and influence our decision-making for future generations. And so I'm really happy that there's so many Indigenous people in degree programs now. And I'm going to say it's a bit of a hard slog sometimes for people who have to maintain their own cultural traditions and also step up and, meet all of the academic criteria that you need to have a voice in those forums. Yeah. So worldwide, we know biodiversity loss is really accelerating at the genetic level, at the species level, at ecosystems levels, all of those. And so resolving these global environmental degradation issues, at the same time dealing with social and economic development, are some of the most critical issues that we face as a human species. But when we lose biodiversity, we lose resilience. We lose when we go turn to monocultures or monocrops. Again, there's a loss of resilience. So we have to be careful with that. And really notice and take those actions, I think, that we can within our own sphere of influence to slow that down or stop it from happening. All over the world, I know we had tremendous fires last year. The smoke, you probably had it in your own areas. There was so much smoke, so much because it's dry, so much drought that the fires start easily. But the research shows that Indigenous people really suffer most from environmental degradation because we're almost always the poorest people in a society. Yeah. And it's true worldwide. So the global north is often thought about as being a wealthy, the global south often thought of as being quite poor. But Canada is as guilty as anybody. We're out mining, in other countries, and we want those resources. We want those. I mean, we have become the new colonizers, right? We're out there taking things that belong in other places. Yep. So, all across Turtle Island, we are working to talk about sustainability, to understand how we are a part of that and what we need to do to make sure that future generations are educated about what is happening and how to take action. Medicine wheel teachings are one of the ways that I think when we introduce Indigenous thought to new learners, it doesn't really matter if you're a new learner or not. I'm very dependent on medicine wheel teachings, and I think that way. I structure my work that way, and so if you don't know what they are, they're spiritual and philosophical frameworks for understanding worldview, and they differ from tribal nation to tribal nation. They differ. The teachings differ. The colors may be slightly different. A lot of times you'll see black, like on the one side there. Like when I was decades ago when I was learning about the medicine wheel, you never saw black in a medicine wheel. But now it's fairly common. So, even in my lifetime, things are changing a bit. Dakota typically have their white in the south. I was taught that by a Dakota elder. So that's different. This is more of Cree visualization up here. Yeah. So Métis people, are mixed blood people. We often follow these traditional teachings that we're belonging to our First Nations, usually grandmothers, mothers and grandmothers. In my case, it was my dad that was the mixed blood. So my mother was Ukrainian, so I'm part of that world as well. Yep. So the 4 quadrants and these teachings are really foundational to helping you to remember, the different directions and the teachings that go with them. Yeah. There's no one right way or wrong way. This is another depiction of a medicine wheel, and I work with this one a little bit. I always get my students to analyze it. What do you see? What do you notice? What do you think it represents? But these are the 7 sacred teachings, 7 grandfather teachings of the Anishinaabe. And when you think about it, all of these things, if you practice them and if you're successful at practicing them, they will lead you to that idea of a good life, that neo-Pamatswin. It will lead you to a good life. It will lead to a healthy environment. It will lead to peace in the world. And so, despite our own human bad behavior and the things that we do, I think we always have to hang on to these foundational teachings that remind us how to be a human being. So there's lots of different ways to talk about sustainability. Aside from medicine wheels, academia has their own specific kinds of graphing and ways of depicting what is going on in the world. So it's just so complex. There's so many in economics, conservation, social development, you name it. In one paper I was reading, there were 67 different sustainability indices reviewed in that. Things like the Human Development Index, ecological footprint, the life cycle index. It all gets very complicated, and I always kind of fall back to, like, it's good to know those things, it's important. But then what do you do about it? And so then you go back to the medicine wheel teachings and you think about the teachings of the 4 directions and the protocols, how to live in a good way. And that helps to make sense of all those indices. Yeah. So I think a few years ago, I read a report that Canada had produced on where it was with sustainability, and we were correctly labeled as laggards in how we were doing in terms of action and reporting. So what they found was that people were really only talking about sustainability in terms of like eco-efficiencies and recycling, green buildings, green spaces, and that's all good, but we neglected to think and talk about human rights, about society, the structure of our societies, economic issues, so all of those things. So when we think about sustainability, we really have to think beyond that idea of not to use plastic straws or not to use a plastic bags. We have to get past that. My students are always horrified when I tell them only about 10% of plastic is actually recycled. Most of it goes to the landfill. Yeah, so there's lots of ways of describing sustainability. Grow Harlem Brundtland led the Brundtland Commission a number of years ago, and their report, which was titled Our Common Future, said that sustainable development is development that meets the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. And that's very much in keeping with what we call the 7 generations philosophy. I don't know if you've heard that, but the idea that the decisions we make today, these are Indigenous teachings, these decisions that we're making today should consider the effects of our descendants for 7 generations into the future. 7 generations is it's a little over probably around 100 years or so. And so when we're making decisions, we have to think about not just ourselves and what satisfies our needs right now, but what about those babies, those grandchildren that are still coming? Yep. So in 2015, the United Nations launched the Sustainable Development Goals. So there's 17 of them. It's very complicated. And they're all issues based. It really got the world all kind of rowing in the same direction. And, some are doing better than others, but young people in schools, they love taking on these topics, and they can really get behind them. Even young kids, elementary kids, I've seen some amazing things come out of their deliberations and projects. We also have another tool at our disposal. It's called the Earth Charter. I don't know if any of you have heard of it, but it was something that was proposed to the UN many years ago, and it was actually rejected, was turned down as a foundational document. And when you think about it, like there's 4 sections to it, there's 16 underlying principles. But what happened at the time was it was recognized that many of the UN member states would not support it. They would never agree to the underlying principles such as women's rights, equality, education, the poor, the vulnerable. So very much a value-based document. And unfortunately, there are many places in the world where these values are not shared. So I still teach about it in my class. I'm actually writing a chapter for a book that they're producing. And they teach at the University for Peace in Costa Rica. Yeah. So if you haven't heard of them or been involved with the Earth Charter, it's really a great movement as well. I'm almost done here. So here in Manitoba, I wanted to share with you something that I'm so proud of, the Indigenous people in northern Manitoba, which is a long ways away. I drove up there once. We drove for 11 hours and we didn't quite get to the end of the highway. But yeah, so creating the Seal River watershed is an IPA. The Seal River is the last river that doesn't have a dam on it, a hydro dam. We're really big on hydropower here. We have a lot of big rivers and generate a lot of power that way. So, when we know that worldwide, most of the remaining healthy biodiversity in the world about 80% of it exists in areas that are governed by Indigenous peoples. And we need that healthy landscape. We need that for our resiliency and for those future generations. So yeah, here's a picture. Yeah. So that whole land, trying to think of I think I looked that up. That's about the size of Costa Rica, that the seal watershed. Yeah, it's quite a big area. So it's the Saisi Dene First Nation and others working with the government. I think there's 4 First Nations involved with that project to protect it. And so it's really it's just it's where the polar bears live. It's just precious. It's precious that we don't go in there and destroy it, like we have with so many other around territories, regions. So as a teacher, all of this, it's nice to talk about, but then you think, well, how does that, how do we influence those future generations so that they pick up and carry on what we're doing? And UNESCO is an important factor in all of that, that they really promote us teaching every individual the knowledge, the skills, the attitudes, and the values that are needed for a sustainable society. And there's just so much to do. The learning how to nurture and plant and the changes that come with growth, and the critical thinking and playing in the mud and playing in water and getting dirty and all of those things that kids are so removed from often. And yeah, so we encourage that. There's a lot more of that happening. School grounds are being changed from, manicured landscapes to having community gardens. And I always get my students to design their wishful schoolyard, and they almost always include chicken coops and livestock, and as a way of teaching young kids. Yeah. In Canada, a couple of years ago, the deans of education, so in all the teacher training programs in universities across Canada, created this accord for education for a sustainable future. And they all signed it, and that's probably one of the reasons I do what I do now. I teach Indigenous education, but I also teach sustainability education, which is just a public class for anybody. Yeah, so the Accord has, just sharing with you a few, the guiding principles of the Accord. The number one principle that they came up with was the importance of Indigenous ways of knowing and being and doing. And so I think almost every school division that I'm aware of has a resident elder or more knowledge keepers. They're on staff, they're available to teachers to work with teachers and children, students. And so there's a lot of, I would call that reconciliation, to help share knowledge and share those the pride of if you're Indigenous identity, or if you're an ally, or if you just want to learn. Yeah. If you're interested, I can recommend Land is Relation as a good book that I have a chapter in. I'm gonna say one of my students came to class and, look at this book I just bought, it's so awesome. And I said, yeah, I heard chapter 8's really good. So he looked at, oh, she's just laughed. So Land is Relation, edited by Margaret Kress and Kahente Horn Miller, who's a Mohawk woman. Margaret's a dear friend of mine. She's Métis woman, and Kahente is yeah, Mohawk. Yeah. I don't know her. But bringing Indigenous knowledges and science together, I love this picture because it's the same bird, but they're different birds. So knowledge is kind of like that. Like when we learn, something might appear differently. It might come from over here, but it contributes to knowledge. And so bringing Indigenous knowledges and sciences together has been a joyful journey for me. I have never yet met a scientist that dismissed Indigenous knowledge, and I've never yet met an Indigenous person who didn't respect and honor a scientist. So I don't know why we don't work more together, but we should. So yeah, we all have something to contribute. And I think is finishing that, for our long-term survival, our lives and our relationships with nature and each other have to change. We have to find those common value systems that drive sustainability in all of our decision making, our day-to-day. So thank you for listening. That was a lot. I hope you're still there.
Well, we're definitely still here.
And there you are.
And there we
Yeah.
are. Well, that was
Everyone's so
wonderful.
quiet.
Yeah. We were rapt. Rapt attention. So,
Yeah.
are you willing to take some questions?
Yeah, sure.
Okay, so if you have
If
a
I can,
question, go
yeah,
ahead. Yeah, if any of you have a question, would you use the little raise hand feature so we can see who you are and then we can call on you. And I could start off with a question.
sure.
So you talked about Indigenous education class. Do you have that online by any chance?
No, it's just part of the teacher training program.
Okay.
But I actually just read something. Okay, yeah. The University of Edmonton has a free online course called Indigenous Canada. And it's very popular. Like thousands of people have taken it. I want to take it. I just haven't had time yet. Yeah. So, but I think I just read something this week that our university is working on developing a publicly available training class. Yeah.
That's great. I would love to take that.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it's so Indigenous Canada, and I think if you look on those free they're called MOOCs. Do you know what that is?
No.
Massive open online courses.
Oh.
MOOCs, they're very popular. Uh um so the one that I often go to is called Coursera. Coursa, Coursera. And man, I took one of the best classes in my PhD degree. I took it for free from Columbia University with
Oh,
Dr. Jeffrey Sachs, uh, who was the advisor to Ban Ki-moon at the UN on sustainability issues. It was an amazing class, free. Yeah.
wow.
And yeah, so if you go into those MOOCs and find one that you like, there's a variety of platforms that will offer those. They often will have, some of them will have free topics on Indigenous peoples. Like it's like recorded lectures,
Mhm.
and then you do a little quiz.
Oh,
And then at the end, if you want to pay $50, you can get a little certificate. Yeah. So I took I took classes, anything I'm interested in. I took a class about waste management. I was interested in that.
mhm.
I took a class about European waterways and how they share their water resources. Just amazing stuff.
Very cool. Okay, thank you. And Elaine, I see that you have a question.
Okay, there. Yes. My goodness, I'm really feeling full. Yvonne, this has been just amazing. I appreciate it. And you talked about sustainability all the way through. I haven't heard the word regeneration yet, and that's something I've been dialed into now for the last little while. That not only regeneration in terms of the land, regenerative agriculture. In fact, when I moved here to this place 3 years ago, my inspiration was to be a steward of the land and to regenerate it using regenerative principles. So that to me, that has been beyond sustainability, not just trying to sustain things the way they have been, but to regenerate. And there's also a regenerative economics course that to me is an absolute breakthrough. It's really breakthrough territory that's making has a big influence on the finance and economics realm with a lot of people. So I'm just wondering if has regeneration come into the conversation as far as what you're up to?
Yeah.
I'm not sure I'm asking that very well, but maybe
No,
you know where I'm going.
Yes, thank you. I would mention that the federal government has for the last few years invested several millions of dollars, millions, many millions, into a new program called Indigenous Guardians. And so they're diffusing program dollars out so that young people can get out on the land, you know, and so monitoring and all of the activities that they do in their projects in terms of uh returning the land to health or making sure it is not getting worse for sure. So yeah, so I think in that way, the Indigenous Guardians program is really an important step that's right across Canada, and all the tribal nations can get involved with those. Yeah.
Wow.
So, but in terms of like, I have not personally seen any land that's been reclaimed from agriculture or like there's remediation that's done when industry moves out of an area. Sometimes like we have a lot of oil up in Alberta area. And so some of this companies, they drill oil wells, and then they, um, eventually like they sort of go bankrupt or whatever, they leave town and these wells are left for the public to pay for the cleanups and stuff, and you have to do that, right? So yeah.
Yeah. So
Let me
we have quite a
clarify
few.
something about regeneration, though. It doesn't mean reclaiming land from agriculture. The way regeneration has been really taking hold is having farmers and people who work with the land work in a different way, so that they're actually regenerating, and a lot of the knowledge has come from Indigenous people.
Oh, yeah, okay,
in terms
Sorry,
of the working with not chemicals and not tilling the land and not destroying things and not imposing things, but really being in harmony with the land in a whole different way.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yes. Yeah, I think that does happen, at least with some of the like ranchers, some of the people I used to sit in committees with were so wise and so willing, they know the land, they're out on the land. Yes.
Mhm. Okay, we have a few more questions, actually several more questions. So Sharon, would you like to ask yours?
Okay. Yeah, I just was wondering, I was at a meeting today and I sat next to a retired teacher, and she made me aware of something that I did not know. She said that in Germany they don't allow homeschooling, and here we allow a lot of homeschooling. Do you all have homeschooling in Canada or not?
Yeah, we do. I don't know. I don't know how popular it is. I don't know a single person that does homeschooling, but I know
Very
it's
popular here.
available, and you have
Yeah.
to fill out your curriculum, and it has to be submitted to the school division, who review it and approve it or modify it. So it's quite a huge process to do that. But I don't know. I have never met a single person who does homeschooling. So not to say that there aren't people, I'm sure there are, but I've never met any. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, it came up, and I don't want to get this into political conversation, but it came up in that the right wing extremists, a lot of them homeschool, and that's how it came up in the conversation. And she said, "Yeah, in Germany they don't have it." And I went, "Oh my gosh, you're right," because I know a lot of I worked for the military for 8 years, and as a counselor, and a lot of the people that homeschooled, and there was lots of military that homeschooled, they were members of the evangelical churches and very right wing people. And I kind of I'd made that connection myself,
Yeah.
but I didn't know that. She said, "Oh, in Germany, they don't do it." I said, "Oh my God, you're right." I made that connection, but I never told anybody about it. And so I was just curious up there, how do if somebody's homeschooling, how do you make sure they teach people about the Indigenous stuff? They teach the right history
Yeah.
and things like that. I mean, it's just a question. So anyway, we'll go on to something else. Thank you. But it just occurred to me, well, are they
No,
teaching?
it's a good question. And even in
If somebody's homeschooling got the Indigenous stuff in it, or are they rewriting history?
Well, it would depend if they were following provincial curriculum.
Yeah.
Like it used to be when I started teaching, you'd get if you were going to teach like grade 9 social studies, you'd get a binder. And in that
Right.
binder, it'd be units and then lesson plans, right? And so you just flip the page and start teaching. But now your whole curriculum document is about 10 to 15 pages. And it's just a list of outcomes and indicators. So here's your goal, and this is your, how to get there, how your what are your markers? How you teach that is up to you. So you can use any resources you want, you can design your lessons in any way. So there's a lot of flexibility in teaching, and it just had to, because the lesson plans that they had were getting so archaic. And there were so many good resources that were not being used. So they had to make that change. But even in our university, Indigenous course, I teach the Indigenous course requirement. You have to have it. You cannot have your degree unless you take my class. Or
Oh, good.
yeah, or someone
Yeah.
else. Or we have 9 Indigenous faculty in our education program. And and so I guess it was a few years ago, I don't know the whole story. I just know that the decision was made. You cannot graduate with any degree from the University of Winnipeg unless you have at least one course in Indigenous history. Indigenous knowledge and history. So it doesn't matter if you're in business and economics or computer technology, you have to have basic understanding of who Indigenous people are. Yeah.
Yeah.
And the
Well,
school,
like here, I'm wondering, yeah.
the schools won't, most of them wouldn't even hire you if you didn't know. Because it's just such
I
an
don't
important.
know what they're teaching today. I mean, because I got a degree in secondary education after I got my degree in business because I wanted to be a secondary teacher, but it never happened.
Oh,
And I mean, just the
never
way
too
things
late.
fell. It just well, no, I was a business teacher, and you know, they get the jobs and they die in them. And so none
Yeah.
of them ever died in my town, so I never got to teach it because nobody ever died and left the
Yeah.
job open. You
Yeah,
know?
I get it. Yeah.
You know, yeah, but I know I had to take like
So
when I moved
Sharon,
to Oklahoma, I had to take Oklahoma history, things like that.
Sharon,
Yeah.
I'm sorry for
Uh-huh.
interrupting, but we have a few people
Yeah.
that have questions
Yes,
and
I
we're
know it. Okay,
running
I'm
out of
sorry.
town. So
Yes,
do you
let's
mind
go
if we
on.
move
I
on?
know, Sharon, it was a
thank
nice
you.
chat.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Paul, you're next.
Hi, I'm Paul Sunderland. Enjoyed your program tonight. Listening, the big question that I've always wondered in terms of what some basic threads or constraints are out there, and I was wondering your take as we think about belief structures. You know, the belief structures of our Indigenous nations strike me as much more about connection and between earth, between living on earth, and between the heavens, and that you're part of the population that came and settled North America. For the most part, it strikes me as fully enveloped around a belief structure of separation. And I was curious in terms of your take on that, whether that's has any validity.
Well, I was just having a conversation about this earlier today, and you know, I, when I'm talking, I'm always thinking about the elders' teachings, and how they taught me to think for myself, but also to listen to the stories. And so I think we have had over this continuum of time of so if you imagine a line, and over here you have people who are real traditionalists in terms of cultural traditions. They are not Christian or Catholic or anything. They're the belief system of their own nations. And then you have at the other end, you have Indigenous people who are very Christianized and strong believers. And then you have people along that continuum that have found ways to have both in their life. And nobody criticizes people for how they believe or what they think. Yeah, so we're kind of not a monolith in that way. Like people like you, we have as many different belief, shades of belief. And I think, like I think about Elder Danny Musquat. You saw him in the picture there. And Danny told me one time, he said, there's no difference. There's no difference between Christian teaching and traditional teachings. It's this, if you really think about that, the principles, it's the same. It's the same. The teachings are the same. And I think people do get caught up into finger pointing and not being willing to be open to new ideas. Sometimes we get a little bit protective about our, our identity and how we imagine our identity to be. I don't know if that answers your question, but as far as I know, when I have sat with the elders, sat in ceremonies, it's the same God, it's the same creator. That is how I understand it. Those are the teachings that I was given by many different elders. And I think sometimes it's it's such a lifelong process to come to those kind of understandings. The question you asked is very, very profound, about how do we live our lives? Really, that's what it boils down to. The choices we make, and I mean, the old people would say, even if somebody lives in a way that you don't agree with, that's their path. That's for some reason that's the path that they have. Yeah. Thank you for asking that question. Now you got me thinking about it.
Thank you.
Yeah. Anybody else?
Yeah,
Emailed.
I have my hand up. I think I'm next in the queue here. I want to go back to the language. And one of the most profound learnings that I had, I just stumbled into. I went back to graduate school and focused on living systems, that I just had to understand what brings life and why does it flourish and why does it thrive. And I found out for myself that in that kind of an understanding, that there is life everywhere. It isn't just gravity or the sun. It's in every conversation, every transaction, every relationship. It's what a relationship's all about, is this energy that is created among people and then among all life, and so forth. And we sometimes label it spirit, but we tend not to talk about it very much in our culture. And I think in the word and I won't pronounce this right, Wâhkôhtowin, I think it is full of that energy.
Mm.
And I think it's so important. And I actually think it relates back to what Paul was asking. My understanding now, as I look at different religions, the mystics of all traditions, there is a mutual energy that in our Western terms is, I think, understood in Christian terms as Christ consciousness. It is a connection to all life. So I'm just wondering if you could talk more about that, because I think it's at the heart and soul of ceremony,
Mm.
of it's in the heart and soul of when you were talking about education, this, how do we design for emergence? It isn't so much about goals and objectives, it's about what creates life and what creates energy in our students, the whole lifelong learning thing. So that's a big question, but I hope you'll give it a little bit of time and thought.
Yeah, when I first came to Manitoba, I began to learn more about Anishinaabe traditions, and I went to listen to these. I think there were 3 elders that were speaking, giving teachings, and to this day, I mean, I cannot repeat those traditional teachings about creation because it's not my place to do that. And there's protocols around that. So I can't, I'm not trained to do that either. But it was amazing. And I thought of that immediately when in the question you're asking about what imbues life, because they teach about that. They tell that story about you know, the existence of everything, of life. Yeah. But it's not mine to tell. Yeah. But if I come across something that I can share, I will share it with you, Milt. Yeah.
Yeah, I don't want to prolong this because other people have questions. But I
Yeah.
think that's what I'm feeling when I listen to you and to others talk
Uh,
about your connection to your people, to the land. You know, it's spiritual and it's an energy that is there for all of us. But we obscured it, I think, in the culture as we approached
yeah.
religion, basically.
Yeah. Thanks for asking that.
Thank you all.
Thanks, Milt. Victoria?
Yeah, I had 4 questions, but I'll just ask one, though it's you may not want to enter it, and if so, I'll ask another one. But I notice whenever I hear or think about the what's happened to Indigenous people, I just feel so sad and mad. And I'm wondering if you could talk, just say what your path to forgiveness is, how you have done that.
Um, yeah, I think we have more, I think it's linked to that Wâhkôhtowin, the choice to be angry or the choice to have a good life. You can be mad and you can poison yourself. You can get cancer. You can make yourself sick being mad at people, instead of getting past grief and mm, mm, it's not that you don't suffer, but I think uh everybody suffers, every single person. And you know, you can't like the sun will come up tomorrow and you still breathe and take a walk and listen to the birds. Uh I take a lot of pleasure in uh the wildlife around me, you know, whether it's a mouse or the birds that come. And uh you know, you can have amazing interactions with the natural world if you're quiet. And I think if you are fearless to some extent, don't do anything dangerous, people. I'm not saying to do anything dangerous, but you know, I think there's an understanding. You know, I'm just talking personal feelings here, that I think there's an unspoken understanding amongst different species. And it seems like they know what your intention is sometimes. Yeah. And I just choose to not be around people that are, you know, maybe they're on their own pathway and maybe they have a lot of healing to do themselves. Maybe they're not good people, maybe they're mean or they lie or they're nasty, whatever. Uh, uh, I, I, I don't know. I don't like conflict because I'm not sure what the purpose of that is. And I certainly don't want it in my life. So, yeah, I just, you know, try to see the best in people. And I understand that sometimes I might make a mistake. Sometimes other people might make a mistake too and do something wrong. And it's not for me to hammer them over it. Yeah. Although my students might say otherwise.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Yeah.
Thank you.
You're
Sister
welcome.
Rosemary, I believe you have the last question.
Oh, yes, I just want to thank you. The last few questions were so profound and at the heart of everything. I just wanted to make a comment about when I lived on the reservation of the Cahuilla, that they're the 5 bands around the Palm Springs area of Southern California. Can you hear me?
I can hear you. Yes.
Yes. They did do a lot of homeschooling, and the reason was to revive their language and their
Mhm.
culture. And I also had an experience with the Tekakwitha conference. I wonder if you're familiar with that.
No, I'm not.
It was started about 50 years ago by Christians, Native American communities of Christian origin who wanted to express their religion in a traditional way. And my tribe of the Cahuilla, they divided the United States, and I think in Canada also. I went once when it was in the University of Washington State, and they divided the country up into 3 sections, and each year they would go to a different section. So when we went in Washington at the university there, from all different religions gathered, actually ministers, and it was 1,600 from all over the United States and Canada.
Wow.
They built a big longhouse and served a salmon dinner to everyone, but they taught the traditions and spoke in their own languages. And my tribe in California went all over the United States and learned this way. And it helped them even develop their own traditions and culture and refined it. So that was really wonderful for me to see. I think I had one other. The other question was if you were familiar with the nuns and nuns or um, land back in the future. Trying to undo the residential school problems and return the land to Native peoples.
Yeah, I'm aware of some of that. You know, the water is life movement and a protection of water as an essential part of life for everybody. The land back. And I think when you think about that, people are, I mean, the motivation for these movements. Up here, we had something called Idle No More.
Oh, yes.
Yeah. And so they kind of come and go. It's but it's an expression of how people are feeling about what they're seeing. And and, you know, instead of giving in to despair and hopelessness, to be able to do something, you know, to get involved with other people who are want to give voice to the land being damaged or abused. You know, all those teachings of Otsinowin, remember that on there? That you don't perpetuate those kind of breaches of natural law. And so in their own way that people want to be able to do something. And yeah, and so I'm always heartened when I see people who are fighting for you know, and risking their lives, quite frankly. People are murdered all the time in different parts of the world for standing up for the environment. You know, it's like we've lost so many Indigenous people because you're just disappeared, you're just killed, you know, in a lot of countries if you interfere with those logging operations or mining operations. And here I think we are more willing to listen to each other, and sometimes there's protests or you know, people are fighting back. But I think it's not so bad as in other places. And we don't want it to get that bad here. You know, hopefully we still talk to each other. But that takes effort, and it takes the forgiveness that you were asking about. It takes that, you know, being able to see past the mistakes we make as human beings, and to recognize that you know, if you think about a person being maybe that little 1% of them made a mistake or makes a mistake, makes bad choices, but maybe there's 99% of them that's awesome, and you just got to find your way around that little spot. Yeah, I don't know, that's just me. I think we have more good to find in people. The bad ones, just crumple them up and put them in the recycle bin.
Oh, okay, we're out of time, but Ron has his hand up and Norma has her hand up. So if there are quick questions, are you willing to take a couple quick more?
Sure. Yeah.
Okay. I
It's
know
only
it's
11
very late
o'clock.
for
It's
you.
only 11 o'clock.
Yeah, I think
You know what? I belong to a group of women educators, an international group of women educators, and we have this poor lady in Finland. So when we meet, it's like you know, middle of the night for her. Yeah.
Yeah. So Ron, do you have a quick question?
I'm uplifted by the fact, Yvonne, that you are a voice, and you are the voice, and you are teaching others to use their voice and giving them the tools to help them do that. 30 years ago, we didn't see much of this. And this wisdom and navigating contemporary life is something that can be so uplifting when we see the young people today lifting up their voices. So thank you so very much. Thank you.
Thank
And
you.
Norma, you had your hand
Well,
up.
this is sort of what I wanted to say also, that all day I have been concentrating on words. The first thing you said is how important words are. And I was working with principles and commandments. And your teaching emphasizes principles, which what I think they are practice. Principles become a practice and a way to live in peace. Well, I mean, the principles I'm thinking of are that I can learn them and practice them and eventually be them.
Yeah.
But they're not commandments telling me what I need to do to be a sensitive person or sensitive to what you're talking about. And thank you just a whole lot for bringing up teaching and the fact that I think in this day and age, we seem to be teaching each other. We are, like I've heard something from everyone here that enlightens me, you know, and your teaching is new, and I think that's what's happening in the world is teaching ourselves to each other is enriching us. So, thank
Yeah.
you.
Yeah, yes, yeah, we're all connected. So that idea of Wâhkôhtowin, every person here, we're connected to each other, right? Through that breath of life, through our shared, you know, like Ilarian, you remember Milt, how Ilarian would talk about this idea that when they greet each other, they say hello, my other self. Remember that? Yeah. And so we're kind of like that. We're the risen environment, right? We're able to talk to each other for a little while. Yeah.
Yeah.
So we remember. Yeah. Thank you, Norma.
Thank
Yeah.
Well, thank you everyone for your questions, and thank you so much, Yvonne, for your wonderful presentation. And let me just take this off of speaker view so we can see everyone, and everyone can take yourselves off mute, and we'll all say good night to Yvonne.
Good night.
Thank
Good
you
night,
so
everybody.
much.
Thanks for
Good
hanging
night.
in
Good
there.
Thank you.
night.
Thank you
for
so
hanging
much.
Thank you.
Thanks a lot,
Bye.
Yvonne.
Bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Great to see
Bye-bye.
everybody. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye. Bye, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Thank you so much, Yvonne. That was wonderful.
Oh,
Yes.
you're welcome. Thanks very much, Dottie, for inviting me. And thanks, Milt. I'm so happy to see you all the time. Why do we not talk more often? Hey?
Great.
Hey, bye-bye.
Bye-bye.